Fredrik Nordström, good to see you. Great to chat with you again. We're going to be talking about heaviness in metal music production, and we're going to be looking at the mix that you did for the In Solitude track and looking at some of your processing approaches for your mix. But firstly, quite a challenging, quite a broad question. Could you have a go at defining heaviness in metal music production?
I don't think it's a really hard question, but heaviness for me it's like down tuning could be, and also it's like heavy playing. You don't like me like this. You play it like with style, and like for example, I said it's like the Rain in Blood album. It's just like it doesn't sound very good, but it's very aggressive and it holds. Sound-wise, it's not good, and performance-wise, it's not good. But it's have a heart in there that brings heaviness.
And so there's different forms that heaviness can take.
Yeah, but now we're not talking about metal music, but if you take symphonical music, you find a lot of heaviness in there also. And it's pretty funny actually, if you look at frequency curve of a symphonical orchestra and a metal band, they are the same.
From recorded music, from recorded metal music, what would you say are the sort of foundational elements that delivers this quality of heaviness to the listener?
It's all instrument. That's what I think. It's like you need to have like heavy played drums, heavy played bass, heavy played guitars, and somebody who's is killing it on vocals.
Yeah, and with all of those instruments sort of like fighting for space, the approaches are different for different bands, I take it.
Yes, because they sound differently, but it's like everybody want to be in top. Everybody want to be loudest, So that's the for example, compression is a very good tool to use there to get everybody heard.
Staying with the subject of performance, what are your approaches to bands with different subdivisions? We were chatting earlier about how challenging the different subdivision speeds with the drums are on this track, but obviously you've produced a very wide range of metal bands, from really, really fast, very aggressive stuff all the way through to sort of hammerfall and more classic metal. What are your observations and your approaches for delivering these bands with different speeds of subdivisions?
It's mainly up to the drums, I think. It's just what kind of drum sound you can use. Like a very ambient like drum sound for a band like Hammerfall is great. But if you have that stuff on, let's say, Dimmy Borgir, it's not going to work. So you need like shorter kind of drum sound.
Yeah. And from a low end perspective?
Try to get it as tight as possible, which is something that means like the bass player needs to play very clear and clean and have a good bass. So that can fuck it up, and if it's playing on double strings and stuff like that, and it's just like, no, it's not going to work.
Obviously, with certain bands, you got to use a lot of beat detective and quantization.
Yeah.
Is it something that you try and avoid, or is it something that you use for most projects?
I try to avoid that, and if I do it, I never go 100%. It's just like very important that you keep some of the performance from the performer. And if everything is super tight, super synced, it's not going to be heavy. So you need to have some, errors in there.
Human feel.
Yeah, human feel.
Yeah.
So that's why when we're tracking guitars and bass and stuff like that, if it's not good, redo. I never edit stuff like that.
What do you feel are the central challenges for mixing metal music, something obviously that you're very skilled at, compared to other genres? We were talking about country music earlier on, but specifically about metal music, what do you feel are the central challenges that differ it from other genres?
I've done some pop projects recently, and that's also because I have not been working so much with that. That's been pretty hard also, to be honest.
In which way was the pop project hard, and how does that differ to a metal production?
The playing is so differently, and there's so much air going on, and it's a a blast beat is hard to get good. And that's also when I do mixing, I always try to use as much as possible of the acoustic drums, so you get some living feel in there also. So you don't just like remove the bass drum totally and just put a trigger in there that sounds like a typewriter.
Again, with these challenges, we've got all of this information that you're talking about, and you know, very fast performances and down-tuned guitars. Yeah. So we've got super low frequencies with super fast performances. What do you feel are the main solutions to these challenges?
I'm normally, it's like, I'm trying to get rid of bass in the rhythm guitars. And bass is bass. That's just like, the bass have its own area. That's where it is, together with the bass drum. And they have to work together, so you can hear the bass and also hear the bass drum and the punch in the bass drum. So what I normally do, like with the guitars, that started with actually early in the 90s. I took a compressor and let it work only in the bass frequencies. So when the guitar go like dun, 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 the compressor goes in and start compressing only in the bass. So that's a trick I have to like, so it not go like this.
And so from a frequency perspective, is there any general areas where you'd say, okay, well, below this point is the bass and above this point is the guitar?
Nothing in frequency, because also depending on the tuning. If somebody's tuned in D or somebody's tuned in B, there's different frequency. So there's no, you have to listen.
Yeah. What, outside of drums, bass, guitars and vocals, what other textures have you worked with that enhance heaviness?
I use a lot of reverb actually. Compression, of course, in several stages, especially on drums. You know, I when I mix, I try to get the band sounds like one unit, which I never achieve.
So on the subject of reverb, generally, how many different reverbs would you use on a drum kit?
Two.
Two.
Yeah.
So like a plate in a room, or a...
As depending on, because it's just like, it can be up to, you know, sometimes I use a short plate and I use a Lexicon 480, like this medium stage hall thing that is classic for the drums. And another day I maybe use an AMS 16 with its non-lin gated Phil Collins thing. Yeah. And it can be a plate, but for the long reverb. So I try to mix it up. It's just like, I very rarely use any presets.
With those different reverbs, do you tend to automate them or just leave the reverb times the same throughout?
Yes, I leave the same time. Normally, yes.
Okay.
If not somebody especially ask for it, that you know, and it also can be. Of course, if it's a slow song, I'd make the reverb longer.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Over the past 50 years, technology has changed hugely, and obviously you've seen that change in technology with Pro Tools and track count and software and amp emulations. Do you feel that the heaviness in metal music can be further enhanced? Do you see many technological changes moving forward, or do you think we've reached a...
No, I don't think that. There was a guy in the 1800s in America said that all inventions are made now, so we can stop. Yeah, and of course this will develop, I think so. It's like when the Black Album came and you hear that kick drum. I was like, wow. It's just like that, but that was... what is Danish guy? He was the guy who started with that click drum, and Bob Rock just took it to where it should be. Yeah. And Pantera 4 Beyond Driven also, there's like development, and I think it's gonna go on. I bought that album actually because of the bass drum, because I wanted to nick it. Yeah. And I did, and then I listened to the album, and it became my favorite album for many years.
Yeah, and was it do gecka? There's the kick drum where you pick it up at the beginning there. Yeah, it's just like a pencil on a pane of glass, isn't it?
Yeah, but it's cool.
It's a great sound. It really is. Moving onwards, do you feel that lo-fi production standards can be as heavy as much clearer high fidelity production standards?
Absolutely, if the performance is right. So that's what I think.
Do you think it's a different aesthetic, that it's more about ambience than heaviness?
I also remember back in this that they put a lot of effort in making the toms sound good. So everything can sound shit, but the toms need to sound great and be big.
Really?
Yeah.
That's interesting. Have you produced bands that have wanted a more low fidelity production aesthetic?
Sometimes people ask for that, but in the end, they want to go more modern.
Right. Okay. When you look at the different bands that you've produced, so, you know, from Dimmu Borgir to Hammerfall, and the different aesthetics of these bands, what are the main elements that you're changing? We've discussed low frequency content and how the way that you put the guitars and the bass together will depend on the level of down tuning. But is there anything apart from the level of down tuning and performance speed that affects how you go about producing them, the sort of the aesthetic of the mix?
They are so totally different bands, and you know, it's like a guitar tone that I should try to tweak for Dimmu Borgir should never, absolutely don't work with Hammerfall. So it's just like, it's a different approach, I think. And yeah, Dim also having all this orchestral stuff, and which you need to have.
And is there a difference in approach about how you go about the mid-range with these bands?
Yeah, like Hammerfall, there should be mid-range guitar. With Dimmu Borgir, you need to have the scooped ones, also to leave space because it sounds cool. And also like for keyboards and orchestral should have some space, and also it's like for the orchestra. If you listen to the original recording and the end result, it's just like by itself it doesn't sound good, the orchestra, but in the mix it sounds good.
And then from that approach with the mid-range of the guitars with Hammerfall and the more scooped guitars for Dimmu, how is there a general principle that you'll then look at the bass for getting the bass and guitars to work together?
For Hammerfall also, again, they are more like the guitars. They're more mid-range, stuff like that, and bass for Dimmu is more scooped also.
What do you feel are the trade-offs in certain areas? Like, you want drum clarity, but with drum clarity there's less cohesion and naturalness. And with the mix, if there's more low end, it can sound less controlled and less clear. What are the elements of the mix that you're trying to balance between the low frequencies and the energy? What's the main way that you're managing the frequency content of a mix to balance these different components?
Yeah, that idea with having the like this big clutch, I kind of give that up with the Pro Tools system because the clearness in this digital recording is so good, so it's hard to get there.
Yeah.
So, but I'm trying to, like, I know that bands also they like to hear them instrument well, so I always try to find somewhere, like if the bass drum is like in 80 hertz, maybe I go like 120 on the bass, so they play in a different area.
Your approaches to clarity at the other end of this, obviously it's a lot about brightness and managing the brightness of the guitars and the cymbals, but do you have any approaches, again back to this idea of cohesion? Do you use saturation plugins or distortion to?
Yeah, distortion I use on bass. That's a very good tool. I also use the Esser on bass.
Yeah.
To get like the bass out, so you can hear the bass, because that brings heaviness to the guitars.
Yeah.
If you have a very good lined up bass player and a guitar player and they play good together, you get a very heavy foundation for a mix.
But you de-ess the bass
Yes.
for the pick attack.
Yes.
Yeah. What's significance and what's your approach with vocals when it comes to heaviness? And obviously we were chatting with Ralph's vocals before about compression. Do you saturate vocals or distort vocals a lot? Or
Sometimes I do that, yes. Not too much, because it just makes it muddy.
Yeah.
Compression is good, absolutely. But sometimes if you get a mix from somebody and they have recorded it in a bad room, and then you start to compressing it and you bring up all this bad room in there, and then you have to go different ways. Maybe sometimes just a little bit of compression and then put a limiter on.
Sure.
Yeah.
And on the subject of limiting, is compression versus limiting, under what circumstances would you use a limiter in the mix?
I have done it a couple of times on rhythm guitars actually, because they have maybe they are 2 tracks with main rhythm guitars, and then suddenly on specific parts there are 4 tracks, and then on specific parts 6 tracks. And how should you manage this? Okay, I can do a lot of automation and sit with that until I get gray hair, but the limiters today are so good, so they don't make any distortion. So you can use the limiter to control the volumes of the guitars so they don't jump up in and out.
Do you use tape emulation?
Very rarely.
Really?
Yeah. Really? I use a tape emulator, but it's called Heat, and it's built in Pro Tools. Yeah, that's I use always.
It's great, isn't it? It's addictive though. You can go too far. I've come back to a mix and gone, oh, I've overcooked it on the mix. It's the brightness is critical, isn't it?
Yes.
Where you add the brightness. But yeah, I think it's the guy from Phoenix who made it.
Yeah. He made that as a rack unit, and it was super expensive. It's like 4,000 euros or something like that. It was just sitting in the nice mastering studios.
Yeah. No, it's
used on our first album with my band actually.
Really?
Yeah.
Moving on to your approach with bussing, do you tend to send all of your drums to a drum aux where you'll compress, and the same with bass to a bus where it's all compressed? And do you use drum, like maybe kick drum and bass, or the whole of the drums and bass to sort of parallel compression? Or
I send, normally it's ending up like here, we have several tracks of bass drum. I send them to a bus, and then a snare drum the same there with trigger and stuff, send them to a bus, and toms to a bus, overhead to a bus. If there are ambience, if there is not one stereo file, I send them to a bus. So if it's just a stereo or mono file, I normally send it to a bus, and then I send bass drum, snare drum, and toms to a parallel compression. But I use this shitty compressor. I tried so many different compressors, but this one is the best. So, and then I send all the drums, including reverb and everything, to a master bus, where I put an EQ on and a compressor, also slight compression.
Right. Do you ever compress the kick drum and the bass together, parallel compression? Or drums and bass together, parallel compression?
No.
Okay. And
the thing is why I don't try this out, because with all the plugins there is so much latency in the Pro Tools system, and I don't really trust that it works with when you're sending stuff with the buses and stuff like that. So
sure. And with your master bus, are you mastering as you mix?
Yes.
Okay.
Because when you use Heat, you put on Heat on the tube side or the transistor side, and it's depending on, and then stuff happen with the mix. So you have to you have to compensate. Sometimes the guitars go louder, maybe the cymbals get too screamy.
Yeah.
As L2, and then you mix that out and you do a mastering, and then you realize, fuck, the guitar gets too loud, which is often the case. And then you have to go back to the mix. So I just started to do the mastering in the mix.
Yeah.
And I also deliver to the client, here's what you get.
Sure.
Yeah.
So we were talking about parallel compression with your kick, your snare, and your toms to the Bomb Factory BF76. And obviously that brings up, you've got sort of ambience getting brought up with the compressor there. How does that impact and inform how you use the room mics?
I'm not a big fan of room mics when it's coming to this fast music, because I try to use them. If the people have recorded them, I'm of course going to try to use them. But that's something when I feel like I had the bass drum, snare drum, toms overhead like working, and then I'm sitting and playing around. I normally also do compression on the rooms, And I use also deathcore sometimes there because the cymbals, when you start compressing, it's starting to get very noisy cymbals.
Abrasive, yeah.
Yeah, so that's where I use deathcore also.
So you'll use just very little of the rooms just to...
Yes, it's depending on what it is.
Yeah.
Yeah, but like 3 albums back with Hammerfall, I didn't use any reverb at all because the room was so good.
Right.
With a good drummer.
Sure.
So it used to like put up the room and we had the reverb, some compression on.
Well, no reverb at all?
Very little.
Very little. Wow, fantastic. And what is your approach with taking drum samples from the kit used for recording and how you might use those?
If I do that, I'm not going to use them again in the production. I use something different.
Right. So you just take them in case a drummer misses a hit or there's a safety. Fantastic. What are the albums that you've produced yourself that you feel most proud of looking back?
The first 2 Dimmy Borgir album is, and actually we did an album with Mike Amot's side project, Spirit Beggars.
Yes.
Yeah, Ad Astra. That was a great album, I think.
But was there something that was very challenging about the production that you needed to overcome those challenges?
No. So just like I remember, like this drummer here, Ludwig, and he have a Ludwig drum kit, and it's just like we recorded analog, and it was just like fun. And I remember the album. I think I like, kind of nailed the sound, and it was just like a fun recording with good songs.
And do you tend to find that it's always the albums where you push up the faders and it mixes itself that tend to be the best albums, or ones where you really overcome certain challenges to get there that have the most original sound and the most powerful production?
I really don't know how to answer that.
No problems. Over the years, your production approaches will have changed and developed.
Yeah.
Where are the areas that you feel it's most changed?
I remixed the first Dimmy Borgir album, the Puritanical album, recently, and I realized how creative we were when we did that album. That was a good area. But also recently, actually, because it's just like, mixing can be a very hard thing. You get anxious and mentally ill, and the last 5-6 years, it's just like, okay, let's do a mix, no problem, just do it, and I do it. Like this song I did for you here, this was one of the most challenging recently. Also the Dimmy remix there, because I know that many bands, when that album came out, was just amazed by the sound, but the band was never amazed by it. So that album we took up and kind of restored all the drums, because Nick Barker's drumming, every single hit on the whole album is 127 velocity. So they are full velocity, every single hit on the whole album. So I had recorded acoustic mics also. So we went back and restored the dynamics in the drums.
Right.
And also when I mixed, I find stuff that, back in those days, we did a lot of keyboards that we put very subtle in the background that nobody heard. So it was just like the time to bring that forward, because we always did a lot of cool stuff. So I probably get some shit from some fans for that remix. But as I say, you have to see it as a new painting.
Do you feel it's more with your approach to dynamics, or perhaps ambience or compression use, that your mix approach has really changed the most?
Yes, I think I'm trying working like it was 1999 and I had an analog tape recorder. I try to be there. I don't try to put on 200 plugins and 4 different EQs, and I have my SSL EQ and I work with that. If there is something that is bugging me, I try to have the Pro Tools built-in 7-band EQ and try to find the frequency that's annoying and just cut up, because they are so sharp in the frequencies.
Yeah.
So you can cut out annoying sounds.
Do you tend to avoid really surgical EQ moves unless you need to?
Yeah, less is more.
Less is more.
Yeah. So it's pretty basic. I did a thing for this nail the mix, and I think most of the people who subscribed that was pretty disappointed when they saw how little plugins I used, because they are mix geeks.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I want to see super fancy tricks, and I don't have them.
No, but at the end of the day, it's what sounds, how it sounds. If it sounds right, it is right. Who matter? It doesn't matter how it gets there.
No.
And a critical mix skill is avoiding over processing.
Yes.
That's absolutely critical. These producers that go in and they're just throwing lots of processing at things, and my students, because I teach music tech, as soon as you go into a session and you see the Pro Tools plugins and they're just, it's not going to be a good mix. You
Yeah, yeah.
almost know, because they're just throwing technology hoping that it's going to help it.
Yeah.
And it's about using the right tool for the right job.
Yeah, we did like a was guest teacher on a high school for sound engineer in the north part of Sweden, and it was the same there. We used to open up and we used Pro Tools, built-in plugins, and the studios there was just talking, oh, there's new plugin here and this new plugin here, and the teacher is so good that you're showing that you're using very simple tools.
From this perspective of performances being gridded and everything being heavily quantized, why do you feel it's not as heavy when it's really heavily quantized?
That can, if you go to metalcore, for example, when you do these breakdowns and stuff like that, that will be a bit sloppy if you don't help the band, if they're not super tight. That's some certain part of music you need to do the editing and line it up better. But if everything hits at the same time, if you have a little space in between, then also let's get bigger.
So it's about size. It sounds more.
Yeah, but if it's too much, then it's going to be sloppy.
Sure.
Yeah, but it's a proper human performance.
Human feel.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
We did Bring Me the Horizon album here, and there was a producer on the internet, pretty famous one, and he said when he heard the guitars on that album we did, and he said that was the best edited guitars I've heard in my whole life. I'm gonna go back and re-edit the guitars on the album I'm doing now. We haven't touched one note. It was all performance.
So from this perspective of lo-fi performances being heavy, still being heavy, what is it about the performances that give it that?
Yeah, but keep a well played aggression in it takes. That's if you have a certain feel when you do something, it's joins into the music in some magical way.
From this perspective of taking drum samples, clean hits from the kit used for recording, so you would use them in case, for example, a drummer misses a tom and you would fly it in from the samples, but you wouldn't use them in the actual mix. Why is that, Fredrik?
We have done it. Sometimes we do, like if the bass drum microphone went broken for 1 minute of recording, then you can replace the acoustic. But it's just like the same. It's the same instrument, and when you cut up the samples, this have to be perfect. Otherwise, you get phase problem.
When you've been mixing Dimmu Borgir, and you were talking about the remix that you did recently and the orchestral elements that originally were a lot quieter, and you've brought them out in the remix, is it about ambience, or is there some way it contributes to the heaviness?
It can do, but it also makes it more, if darkness is heaviness, if you understand what I mean. Yeah. So it brings in an atmosphere, absolutely, but it can also be, it's depending on what part it is in the music.
Darkness, that makes sense, actually. That does make sense, that it introduces a dark texture.
Yeah, but it's like the intro of we did on Puritanical, and we was and it's very dark, I think, and we was for 3 weeks we were recording water drops in the kitchen to get the right drop like this. So it's actually for my kitchen, And I just did it all the time. Oh no, it's too fast. It's too slow. No, I don't like it. Oh, the sound went bad, and so on. So like in week 3, we managed to get them right. Me and Øyvind, the keyboard player.
Wow. It's an incredible album,
Yes.
Puritanical. It's absolutely, it must have been very, very challenging to carve up all of those frequencies to get all of that instrumentation, very fast performances with all the orchestral elements into stereo, retaining clarity and retaining heaviness. It must have been incredibly
Yes, and the
challenging.
album after also was, then we had the full symphonical orchestra. We went down to Prague and recorded that.
Yes, yeah, that's right.
Yeah. So I remember on that album, there was a lot of editing we had to do on the orchestra, because in orchestra, it's not like 1, 2, 3, 4, bam. They don't start like that. They go run like this. And
Yeah.
that's what we didn't want. So I spent a week of cutting all this orchestra stuff. And then if I don't remember wrong, in the mix, there was multi-band compression of the orchestra, there was EQ, there was some other shit in there also.
Wow.
Yeah.
How long was the album mixed? How long did it take to mix? Was it
2 weeks, I think.
No.
That's a long time.
Really?
Yes.
For an album that's that complicated, because of the amount of editing. Do you tend to do all your edits and clean up first and then you go to actual mix?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, first record. Don't do anything editing while recording. I hate
Yeah.
that. That's the worst thing I know. Sometimes you have to do a little one, but mainly recording. And then you do editing.
And on that front, do you always go with waveform edited toms, or do you sometimes use non-waveform edited toms?
I have been chasing drummers for 25 years to manage to get them to play hard. And recently I realized it's better they play even.
Right.
Yes, it's much better, because you can bring the power in the drums out anyway, if they don't play super soft. But get them to play more even.
Sure.
And then, like in this room here, you just put the noise gate on.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's fine.
Sure.
And sometimes you get stuff, it's like 65 minutes of music and you cannot see where the toms are in the tom mics. And you're like, then I'll go to Rob. Rob,
Yeah, sort it out. Oh, yeah. You take care of this. Fantastic. Staying with this idea of classical and orchestral music and its relationship to metal music, is it to do with the darkness or the emotions or the textures or the similar frequency content, or has it got some similarities to what electric guitars are doing?
I think it's coming to composition actually, because you have like kind of the same frequency area as heavy music, and also you have a lot of heavy instrument in symphonical orchestra music. Like we were in Prague recording this Dimmu Borgir album, and they had this gong, and it's like 50 meters like up in the roof, and you played on that gong, and when you smashed it really hard, your whole body was shivering like this, and that was heavy.
On the Bring Me the Horizon album, there's certain elements that have been introduced to the mix, such as sub-bass hits and some additional percussion elements, certain hits. Is that to create more dynamics or to create increased heaviness, or?
Yeah, I think it's a way of increasing heaviness. I think it's like when you go into a breakdown, and then and this sounds is taken from the hip hop music, actually. So like the band Bring Me, they are like been like always into like non-metal music, if you understand what I mean. Like the second album we did here, they had this guy especially doing all this dance music stuff and these sub drops and.
Thanks, Fredrik. We'll now move to the mix session, if that's okay, having a look at your processing approaches and how you solved all of these challenges that the multi-track provided to you.